Okay, I'm going to begin with the static view that was suggested might be not fully informative, but I do think that there are certain basic identities. Economists disagree about a lot of things, but one thing that they all agree on is the sum of global exports has to equal the sum of the imports. As I say, as long as trade with Mars and Moon remains limited. So there are errors and omissions. I realize that numerically it doesn't add up, but we'll ignore that. There's a really, identities, even though they don't have a lot of, they are always true, actually have a lot of content because they imply that a country that increases its net exports, its surplus, can only do so if some other country increases its net imports. And the implication of this is that if in a global general equilibrium, if some country pursues policies that persistently leads to net exports, then there must be some other country or countries that have net imports. And a lot of what we're talking about today is precisely about that. The patterns of surpluses and deficits are not just the result of market forces. They're a result of market forces interacting with decisions of governments, monetary policy, wage decisions, pressures, and it's that whole configuration. And the configuration that has emerged is one which, I'll try to argue, is not sustainable, and in fact is not only not sustainable, isn't very good for the current situation in several countries around the world. The question that was posed a little bit earlier during Paul Martin's talk, where it suggested that Greece's problems are not just those of Greece, but those of other countries, including Germany, I think was very apropos, that in fact you can't solve Greece's problems or Spain's problems or Portugal's problems without looking at the broader general equilibrium, and that includes looking in particular at Germany and the other surplus countries. The nature of the problem is, in a general market economy, of course, there will be some countries with surpluses and some countries with deficits. It would be a peculiar situation if each country had a zero trade balance. So the issue today is not whether some countries have a surplus and some have a deficit, but it's the magnitude of those surpluses, the persistence, and when I say persistence over a number of years, I don't want to go back in history 10 or 15 years. The question is modern history, recent history, persistence, and the pattern. And part of the pattern is that there is something very peculiar, and I'll come back to this a little bit. Part of it has to do with demography. While it is true that Germany is aging, it's also true that other countries are aging, like the United States. And if all the aging countries were having a pattern of surplus, there'd be a real global problem. It wouldn't add up. But it's also partly a quandary, and I'll come back to what about countries, the emerging markets, developing countries, you might have thought standard economic theory would predict that they would have a deficit, and some of them have very large surpluses. And we want to try to explain why that's so. Well, countries that have, as I said, when there's a surplus, that means there's some other countries with a deficit. When countries have persistent trade deficits, they have problems. In fact, there are two problems. One is that it may be difficult to finance cumulatively high levels of foreign indebtedness relative to GDP. And this is especially true if the trade deficit arises from imported consumption. And that's the notion of debt exhaustion. Now, it's interesting here that it really does depend, to some extent, on what you spend your borrowing for. If you borrow for investment, it very much is very different from whether you're borrowing for consumption. And that was one of the, some remarks about financial markets not seeming always to be far-sighted. You would have thought that financial markets would look at countries' balance sheet, government's balance sheet, national balance sheet, and realize that on the one hand, if deficit's going up, and the other hand, investment is going up, both sides of the balance sheet are going up, and if the investment is high return investment, the country is actually better off. And it is remarkable that it is that the financial markets continue to focus only on one side of the balance sheet. The second problem is high levels of net imports weaken aggregate demand. They weaken aggregate demand at the national level, and of course, if you have countries, as pointed out, if you have countries that consistently are not demanding goods, but are producing goods, there's a global aggregate demand problem. And that's part of what the world is facing today. At the national level, when countries are facing large trade deficits, large levels of imports, there's a way that you can substitute to maintain full employment, and one way is to do that is for the government to run a large fiscal deficit for the government spending to substitute for imports. By the way, I just want to emphasize a question that was implicitly, or actually quite explicitly raised again in Paul Martin's talk. Canada was successful in cutting back its spending and growing because it could substitute government spending with exports. But when everybody is in an economic slowdown, that can't happen. And so this shared austerity is a recipe for global disaster. But even at the national level, if you have these large imports and you try to offset that by, that weakens aggregate demand, if you try to offset that by fiscal spending, by borrowing, eventually your debt gets up, and again there's another form of debt exhaustion. Interestingly, we've looked at the pattern of fiscal and trade deficits. It used to be said that fiscal deficits cause trade deficits. But if you look at a test of Granger causality, in at least one of the G7 countries, it goes very much the other way, that it is trade deficits that force governments to spend money that cause the fiscal deficits. Well, the consequence of the view that the sum of the trade deficits have to equal the sum of the trade surpluses is that if the surplus countries insist by one means or another, policy, interest rates, and so forth, if they insist on maintaining the surpluses, then the trade deficits act like hot potatoes. What do I mean by that? It means that if some country has a deficit and it starts to face a crisis and it does something to get rid of the deficit, does that mean that the deficit disappears? No. The deficit has to be in the system. If the sum of the surplus are at some number, the sum of the deficits have to be that same number. So if you have the East Asia crisis and Korea and Thailand and Indonesia say, we can't run trade deficits anymore, what happens? Some other country has a trade deficit, and then you have a crisis in Latin America. So these trade deficits, if you have countries that insist on being surpluses, act like hot potatoes. Now, one of the things that happened over the last 10 years, 15 years, is that most countries have learned the lesson. They've learned the risks of persistent trade deficits. And that creates a real problem. If most countries aren't willing to have a trade deficit and can engage in competitive devaluation or other instruments, and you have a few countries that insist on having a surplus, so most countries are trying to have zero, a few countries have a big surplus, what does that mean? Well, it has to be absorbed somewhere, and we now have in the world a country that is acting as the deficit of last resort, and that's the United States. And that is not sustainable. And the question is how long it will last. We don't know. Economists are not very good at predicting turning points. But what is clear that the U.S. has been having a deficit equal to, almost equal to the sum of all the surplus countries put together, and it is a consequence in some part of its own actions, but largely a consequence of the fact that it's been acting passively. So as I said, the U.S. has become to a large extent the deficit of the last resort. As other countries take actions to reduce their trade deficit, if surplus countries maintain the policy of sustained surplus, then the U.S. deficit essentially equals the sum of the surplus. But as I said, the situation is not sustainable. So what happens? What can the trade deficit countries do? Well, economists' normal response is simply to say, let the market take care of it. Let's adjust the exchange rate. But the problem with exchange rate mechanisms is the responses are slow, and other countries may take countervailing actions. So in the case of the United States, we haven't officially adopted a policy of competitive devaluation, but a lot of people read QE2 as an unofficial policy of competitive devaluation. The only thing that, unfortunate thing about QE2 was Brazil, China, India, most of the other countries decided they didn't like it very much. And they didn't act passively. So they intervened in their exchange rate. China built up a couple $100 billion of reserves. Brazil imposed all kinds of interventions in the financial system, as Thailand did. And so the interesting response is, rather than getting, we got a little bit of competitive devaluation, but rather getting the competitive valuation that we had hoped to get, what we got is a fragmentation of global capital markets. Ironic, because the United States have been the most active advocate for integrated financial markets. In the context of Europe, adjusting the exchange rate is not a real possibility of the other members of the Eurozone. That was a big mistake, I think, that many economists believe they made when they joined the euro. It was not an optimal currency area, and you took away the exchange rate and adjustment mechanism, interest rate adjustment mechanism, and you didn't put anything in its place, and you still haven't put anything in its place. So in a way, the other countries, like Spain, have joined the U.S. as part of the system of deficits of last resort. And let me emphasize, the internal devaluation is not an effective substitute. The idea of lowering wages is not an effective substitute. If internal devaluations were an effective substitute, the gold standard would never have been a problem, because you could have just adjusted relative to the gold standard. So internal devaluation wasn't effective in the Great Depression, and now with cross-border debt obligations, when your wages go down and you owe money in euros, you're worse off, and it's even less of a feasible alternative. There's one more aspect I just want to bring in here because it hasn't been part of the debate. We always want to keep in mind what the function, what the purpose of the economy is. It's not to produce GDP. Let me make that clear. The purpose of an economy is not producing GDP. It's increasing the welfare of citizens. And it's increasing the welfare of most citizens. And the American economic system has failed very badly. Most Americans today are worse off than they were. Most American households have a lower real income, adjusted for inflation, than they had 15 years ago. The income of a full-time male worker in the United States, median income, is lower than it was in 1968, almost a half century ago. And that's of a full-time male worker, but hours have gone down, and if you look at the median male worker, his income has gone down substantially. So in fact, our economic system has not been delivering. And the same thing is true to a large extent for Germany as well. And now to say to the German workers, or the workers in Spain, or the other countries, in order to make our wonderful system that's increasing GDP work, all of you have to have a lower standard of living. Most citizens have to be worse off. I think you have to really defend the system and say, why is this system that is making most citizens worse off year after year, why is this a system that deserves support? And I think in the end, it's going to be very hard to do that. Well, more generally, exchange rates are determined today by capital flows as much as by trade. In a world of unfettered capital flows, managing exchange rates may be very difficult. Though I have to point out, preventing appreciation, an overvalued exchange rate, is easier than preventing depreciation, that is an undervalued exchange rate. So one mechanism doesn't work very well is adjusting exchange rate. We could go on, explain why, other reasons why it hasn't worked. The second one, mechanism is the one that many countries are trying. It's what part of the adjustment mechanism that the IMF used in East Asia. It's the part of the mechanism that Europe is now using against the periphery. Is you tell the countries the way you can adjust your trade deficit is stop spending. And you're not allowed to impose tariffs. That would be an easy way to stop spending. You're not allowed to do that. So how do you stop importing? Well, kill your economy. If people have no income, guess what? They won't import a lot. And that is the recipe that Europe is suggesting for Spain and the other countries. And it's the recipe that IMF used in Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea. Not a very good recipe. It certainly is not a welfare-enhancing recipe. It has huge social and economic cost. Another basic aside that I think you ought to keep in mind is we know that the financial markets misallocated capital, misallocated risk before the crisis. What happened before the crisis was very inefficient, massive amounts of waste of resources. Even the Greek government didn't do everything perfectly. Lots of waste of resources. But most of the waste of resources has happened after the bubble broke and after we realized that mistakes have been made. That is to say, the loss in economic resources between the potential GDP and our actual GDP is in the trillions of dollars. And most of that is a result of policy. And it's the kind of policies of trying to adjust by reducing income that is the source of enormous economic waste in the world today. Well, there are some other ways of doing it. They're not very nice and they're not very friendly, but they could work. And some of them have actually been suggested by respectable people. And it shows you where the world may be going unless we get the system to work a little bit better. One of them is a suggestion by Warren Buffett where he just said, well, the easy way for the U.S. to correct its trade balance, every time anybody wants to import, they have to have a little chit. And the way you get a chit is that exporters will get a chit. And therefore, this demand for chicks would have to equal the supply of chicks. And that means exports would have to equal imports. And we could very quickly restore trade balance. And that would stimulate the U.S. economy. It is, however, of course, equivalent to having a multiple exchange rate. And some people are not so enthusiastic about that. But the other point I want to raise has to do with the first slide that I put on, which is the sum of the deficits has to equal the sum of the surpluses. So if the U.S. stops being a debtor of last resort and goes into zero, mercantilism is really going to have a problem. The surplus countries, the question is, those surpluses, where are they going to go? Okay, I'll have to talk a little faster. Okay. The general point I want to raise, and this is really important, is that there are very large and important macroeconomic externalities. Policies of one country have effects on others, which they typically don't fully take into account. The surplus countries, for instance, lower global aggregate demand. They impose costs on all other countries and a systemic stability of the entire system, which is why Keynes argued for a tax on the surplus countries. It's not just the deficit countries that are the problem, it's the surplus. And I'll come back to a way in which this can be done, which is a follow-up to a suggestion that Keynes made. Just very briefly, are there justifications for running a surplus? I want to emphasize it's not just naive mercantilism. It's not going back to pre-Smithian economics. There are three, I think, quite valid reasons. One is building up precautionary balances. This is especially relevant for commodity exporters, like high volatility of commodity prices, but it's also understandable in the aftermath of the East Asian crisis, where those without adequate reserves had to pay a very high price. As the prime minister of one of the countries told me, we were in the class of 1997. We learned what happened if you don't have enough reserves. And he went on to say, never again. And then they started building up reserves. And interestingly, this has been reinforced by the experiences of the 2008 crisis, where the countries that had the largest reserves did the best. There's a second argument, which has to do with learning by doing, industrial policy, learning by exporting. Export-led growth has been the most successful part of development among the emerging markets. And we have to admit that. And we also have to understand that the WTO has circumscribed the ability of countries to have industrial policies. As one of my friends at Cambridge University wrote a very powerful book called Pulling Up the Ladder. And what he said is, look, you guys did it by industrial policy, and now that you've succeeded, you won't allow us to do it. You're pulling up the ladder, and that leaves them no instrument other than exchange rate policy. And I think we ought to revisit the WTO. The third is the one that was pointed out. Demography is a good argument for having surpluses, but it's not a good explanation for most of the current patterns. But whatever the validity of the justification, pursuing their own interests, surplus countries impose costs on others which they systematically have not taken account. Now, it seems to me it's very clear that our current system is dysfunctional, and there are some other aspects that reinforces this dysfunctional system. I don't have time to talk about them, but the most important aspect is the dollar-based reserve system. It's an anachronism in the 21st century, widespread agreement that it was an anachronism. There was hope that France would, as the head of the G20, put this at the head of the table. There was an early moment when they said they were going to. The US said we don't like that idea because we enjoy what is sometimes called the exorbitant privilege of being able to borrow at zero interest rate. And as long as there are foolish countries and countries foolish enough to lend to us at minus 2% real interest rate, we want to keep the current system, no matter how unstable and how inequitable it is. And so it was not on the G20 table, but eventually it will have to come to be talked about. Is there anything that can be done to prevent the surplus countries from running a surplus? And I think the answer is yes, if the deficit countries refuse to run a deficit or if there's a global agreement. But of course, in the absence of that kind of agreement, there are going to be some problems. Well, there's an alternative to this unilateral approach, and that is to try to approach it from an alternative global financial framework. And let me just summarize those very quickly. First is a global reserve system. And here, one part of the global reserve system is provisions to discourage excessive surpluses. And that was very much part of Keynes's original provision. Secondly, reform of WTO to allow developing countries to engage in industrial policies. Third, global financial market regulation, capital account management, with a focus on limiting destabilizing short-term capital flows, which have these very adverse effects on exchange rates. And finally, a globally coordinated monetary policy. The kind of competitive devaluation that the United States has been involved in as part of QE2, obviously is a source of disturbance to the global economy, as is policies that allow countries to maintain surpluses. So let me conclude. Surpluses are not created just to advance a mercantilist agenda, but there are valid reasons for developing countries to pursue industrial policies. But whatever the rationale, surplus countries impose costs on others. And the persistence of these surpluses has led to outcomes that are not sustainable. We are leading to a problem of debtor and deficit exhaustion, representing a risk for global stability going forward. Global instability is as much or more a result of the behavior of the surplus countries as of the deficit countries. And, you know, I know people like to give sermons about Greece, but we have to remember, if Greece were the only problem of Europe, we wouldn't be worrying about a euro crisis. It would have been fixed. Spain, Ireland had surpluses, had fiscal surpluses and low debt GDP ratios before the crisis. And even if people misbehave, you have to look forward and say, okay, we don't want to have a crisis in the future, but what do we do with the crisis that we have today? And if we impose enormous costs, all we're going to do is waste more resources in underutilization of our resources. Most importantly, the tone of indignation is not justified. The advice that others should follow their ways is impossible. It is simply impossible for all countries to have a surplus. So, you know, that's arithmetic. So the question is, if you're going to give advice to countries, it has to be consistent with basic global international identities. The better way than the unilateral actions which countries could take there are unilateral actions which I said they could take, but that would be highly unstabilizing. The better way would be for reforms in the global financial and trade system of the kind that I very briefly outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all right. Thank you.